Good morning. I'm so excited to be with you today. Happy Mother's Day. I'd like to shout out my mom and my sisters, who sometimes act like my mother. I don't know if my sister's watching, Rena, but I know you would ask me, Ethos, did you put on makeup? And I did. It's subtle, but I did. Also, shout out to the Preaching Boot Camp team. Thank you for helping prepare, for Kelly for support, and Benina and Jonathan and Angela for feedback. This is my first sermon. The sermon's going to contain a description of deep psychological pain. So if you feel the need to take some space or to go out to the lobby, disengage, feel free to do so. And until you're ready to return, I won't be offended at all. In the summer of 2021, two things happened that stand out. God winked at me, and I experienced severe anxiety. First, the wink. A colleague, Dr. Alfie Breland-Noble, who had previously introduced me to a youth mental health campaign that I'm a part of, asked me if I did consulting in an area of work that I wasn't sure that I was an expert in. And whenever someone asks me to consult in an area outside of my expertise, I'm not sure that my knowledge is adequate for what might be needed. And so in this instance, I wasn't sure that I was the best person. So I told her that I could refer her to someone else, someone that might be more appropriate for what her contact needed. And all of this happened over email. I remember having a sensation that was hard to explain. It wasn't a voice, but just this distinct thought or feeling that there was more, and that I should not avoid or turn away from that more, and that I was enough for what was ahead. As someone who struggles with her faith, I call these God winks. Small moments that give me hope that God is real and might have a plan that I can be part of. Maybe it's just a fantasy, but it's what I call it. Not too long after that, I fell into a period of severe anxiety, not unlike periods I've experienced at other times in my life. I saw that anxiety impacting my relationship with my husband and kids. One of my kids was going through something and I was feeling guilty. Guilty that I was impacting our quality of life, that maybe it was my fault that one of my kids was struggling, and that I couldn't be fully present because my anxiety was overwhelming me. I had the thought that my husband, who tends to have a more lighthearted disposition than I do, is extroverted and who does everything he can to make me happy, would have been better off marrying someone else. Someone who didn't find the negative and put a damper on things, someone a bit more charming and outgoing. And that I was depriving my kids of opportunities. I didn't want to reach out to friends because I didn't want to get into what I was going through or burden them with a long text or get into it in a phone call. As a suicide researcher, for the first time, I viscerally understood what researcher Thomas Joyner wrote in a book called Why People Die by Suicide. I was experiencing perceived burdensomeness, the feeling of being a burden to others, and thwarted belongingness, a feeling of not belonging, two characteristics that are thought to be associated with suicidal thoughts. My anxiety was a burden to my family, and it made me feel isolated. I posted something about my anxiety on social media, maybe to connect with the outside world, in case someone else was feeling the same thing, so that they might know that someone who ostensibly seemed fine could be struggling. And I received lots of supportive messages, even from people with whom I hadn't been in contact for a long time. Kind and well-meaning messages of support. And in the midst of that virtual support, I remember thinking, if I were suicidal, I could kill myself right now, and no one would have seen it coming. No one would be able to do anything about it. My husband and kids are not home right now. All of these supportive messages on social media, both from friends and from people with whom I don't interact regularly, while kind, didn't make me feel any less alone in my pain. While I was not seriously contemplating ending my life, the sadness and the pain that I felt made me understand more deeply why people do so. I did not want to feel the pain anymore. As a suicide researcher, that knowledge was both humbling and sobering. This is not going to be a story about how I overcame anxiety. This is a story about what my anxiety taught me about relationships, how easy it is to seem connected but feel alone, and how despite our best intentions, sometimes the typical ways that we address mental health can be detrimental to us. It also taught me about how God calls us into deeper love and community. The Bible doesn't speak specifically on the topic of mental health, but there are various scriptures that can be interpreted in the context of mental health. And one of these is Mark 5, verses 1 through 20, and I'm going to read part of it and then summarize some of it. This is from the translation, The Message. They arrived on the other side of the sea in the country of the Gerasenes. As Jesus got out of the boat, a madman from the cemetery came up to him. He lived there among the tombs and graves. No one could restrain him. He couldn't be chained, couldn't be tied down. He'd been tied up many times with chains and ropes, but he broke the chains, snapped the ropes. No one was strong enough to tame him. Night and day he roamed through the graves and the hills, screaming out and slashing himself with sharp stones. Now the passage goes on to describe how the man recognized Jesus, bowed in worship before him. Jesus healed him and cast out the evil spirits. And the evil spirits asked to go into a herd of pigs that was grazing on the side of a hill. And so Jesus sent them into the pigs, and when he did, the pigs ended up stampeding off of a cliff into the sea and drowning. And when the people heard about what happened, they came to Jesus and saw the man sitting there wearing decent clothes and making sense. And they started telling more people about it. The passage goes on to say, at first they were in awe, and then they were upset over the drowned pigs. They demanded that Jesus leave and not come back. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the demon-delivered man begged to go along, but he wouldn't let him. Jesus said, go home to your own people. Tell them your story, what the master did, how he had mercy on you. The man went back and began to preach in the 10 towns area about what Jesus had done for him. He was the talk of the town. I'd like to start out by talking about how some interpretations of this passage can be problematic and are part of the problem. During the Middle Ages, mental illness was viewed as a form of demon possession in the church. Words such as mad, insane, or crazy were used during that time, and in the post-medieval area to describe people with mental illness. Exorcism was a common form of treatment. Later, those with mental illness began to be sent to asylums, which over time became our modern-day hospitals. As treatments evolved, mental health became the exclusive purview of specialists such as psychiatrists and psychologists. Now, there are some other noteworthy things about this Mark 5 passage. The man lived away from others and among the tombs and graves, basically living among the dead. He was tormented, disruptive, harmed himself, couldn't be tamed or chained. He recognized Jesus, and Jesus cast out the evil spirit, sending it to the pigs, who drowned. And then Jesus restored the man to the community from which he'd been isolated, charging him with telling his story. The community was in awe at first, but then upset because they lost their livelihood, the pigs. It took being completely healed through a direct encounter with Jesus for the man to be back in community. But as my friend and colleague, Jovelis Mañana, shout out there, pointed out, healing did not get rid of the problem. Jesus sent the demons into the pigs, which destroyed the livelihood of the members of the community. The man's healing came at a cost. Moreover, Jesus could have said to the man, come with me, let's roll. But instead, he sent him back to the community to deal with the aftermath and to tell his story. So ultimately, this passage suggests that healing comes through the power of God, through Jesus, but that is collective. The community bore some of the economic cost of the healing, but experienced God through the power of the man's testimony. About half of the U.S. population will experience symptoms of mental illness at some point in their lives. And one place where there's been increasing interest in addressing mental health and mental illness has been in the church. And the church can be a great place of support for people who are struggling, but it can also stand in the way of them seeking help. If we're completely honest with ourselves, we see Jesus as the healer, but we also see the person struggling as the madman. Some of us come from church traditions where if you're anxious or depressed, it's because there's something wrong with your relationship with God. Maybe you aren't trusting enough, or you need to pray more. If you still aren't healed, it's because you aren't allowing God to heal you. If you worry, you lack faith. We're told that going to church will fix things, and if we're still struggling, then it must mean that we are the problem. So we keep silent so that we aren't judged. The stigma surrounding mental illness creates a circumstance in which we don't know how to address it because we don't allow ourselves to learn how. In a recently published book on the social roots of youth suicide, sociologist Anna Mueller and Seth Aberton write, "The power of stigma is its multi-pronged attack. Whether we want to or not, it can be quite challenging not to internalize, at least to some extent, cultural beliefs about our personal experiences with mental illness or mental health struggles. And when we internalize these beliefs, even if only partially or unconsciously, that in turn can lead to imagined or anticipated blame from others, in addition to real judgments we may experience. We quickly learn what others think about someone with a mental illness and begin the process of hiding that part of ourselves to avoid being judged. Because we can anticipate just how people will react to the knowledge under the specter of mental health stigma. We don't expect kindness or the encouragement of help seeking. Rather, we expect judgment and blame. Importantly, social blame and judgment, or even just the expectation of it, often leads to deep shame. Let me tell you, one of the biggest conversation stoppers at dinner, if you're a suicide researcher, is to tell people that you're a suicide researcher. You get comments such as, "That must be so sad," or "That must be so hard," followed by a shift in conversation. And that's just for someone who studies suicide. So imagine what it's like for someone thinking about it. An interesting thing happened in the summer of 2021 that led to a bit of an epiphany for me. A few weeks after that moment of anxiety that I described to you earlier, I took my daughter to visit my college town for the first time in New Haven, Connecticut. We stayed in an Airbnb in Fairhaven, about 10 to 15 minute drive from campus, walked around the campus of Yale University, ate some of the best tacos that we've ever eaten in our lives. I didn't know Fairhaven, Connecticut, best tacos. At least that's what we claim to this day. And here's a collage of photos from that time. By the way, my daughter's downstairs with the kids, and if she were here, she would say, "Mom, how could you do me dirty like that?" Exposing me that way in these photos. We had a really great time during that trip, to the point where there have been times when we've gone to even better college towns, and my daughter will say, "It's not New Haven." During that trip, I had a virtual session with my therapist, in which I told her about this experience of emotional pain that helped me understand what it was like to have perceived burdensomeness and sort of belongingness, and how it made me see things differently as a suicide researcher. I also told her why, based on suicide theories, I wasn't at risk of attempting suicide. At the end of our session, she recommended that we increase the frequency of our sessions because she was worried about me. I wasn't sure I needed to, and I left the session wondering if there was more wrong with me than I realized. I started to question whether I was actually feeling better or whether I was just fooling myself. While I understood my therapist's concerns, it was the first time I'd ever talked about anything suicide adjacent in relation to myself, besides the work that I do. I was very clear that I had no desire to kill myself. Despite my therapist's good intentions, I ended the session feeling misunderstood by my therapist, and as if I'd missed some important information about my level of distress. This led to a realization that taking a fear-based approach to mental health can inadvertently hurt. My therapist probably wanted to make sure that I would be okay just in case I was at risk of attempting suicide by increasing our sessions. It's what many clinicians might have done. It's hard to predict suicide risk. However, fear-based approaches to suicide prevention sometimes lead people to increasing degrees of intervention that some people may not want or need, but get, and that others do want or need, but don't get when resources are scarce. People who think about or attempt suicide are often excluded from clinical trials of therapies for depression or anxiety because researchers don't want the responsibility of assessing risk. And what this means is that the therapies that have some of the best evidence behind them don't adequately prepare therapists to work with certain patients, such as those who think about suicide. And their care is left to emergency departments and inpatient psychiatric hospitals, away from their communities. As you can probably discern, there's mental health stigma even among mental health professionals. As a community of followers of the teachings of Jesus, we are tasked with helping people heal who may otherwise be cast aside, through direct encounters with them, knowing that this healing may come at a cost. But if we're willing to bear the cost, maybe we'll also experience awe at who God is through the power of their testimony. A start in getting real about our mental health and how to address it is to foster authentic community that encourages disclosure without fear of judgment, rejection, or punishment. Community of the sort described in this passage from 1 John. This is how we come to understand and experience love. Christ sacrificed his life for us. This is why we ought to live sacrificially for our fellow believers and not just be out for ourselves. If you see some brother or sister in need and have the means to do something about it, but turn a cold shoulder and do nothing, what happens to God's love? It disappears, and you made it disappear. My dear children, let's not just talk about love. Let's practice real love. This is the only way we'll know if we're living truly, living in God's reality. It's also the way to shut down debilitating self-criticism, even when there's something to it. For God is greater than our worried hearts and knows more about us than we do ourselves. And friends, once that is taken care of, and we're no longer accusing or condemning ourselves, we're bold and free before God. Back in the summer of 2021, a colleague who's also a former student reached out to me and said, I saw your post on Facebook and I wanted to see if you're okay. If you need to talk, I'm here. It was meaningful because we were in regular contact with each other outside of social media. I felt comfortable replying. We were already in each other's lives. And that was the beginning of my slow realization that my social media use was fueled by a fundamental desire for community, but it also bred superficial interactions that ostensibly made me feel temporarily connected and in community. But as someone who longs for deeper connections of the sort described in the scriptures, it was a false substitute. Social media does not require us to live sacrificially for each other, simply to click a button and think that we're doing so. Living sacrificially means that we're willing to engage in the messiness of relating, being vulnerable, having difficult conversations, making mistakes, getting hurt, showing each other grace, and bearing the cost of healing, to do what Galatians 2 describes as carrying each other's burdens, and in so doing, fulfilling the law of Christ. One of my colleagues recently told me that true healing comes from being in it together. And an example of that in my life came from a place where I least expected it, work. I'm a college professor who has a very diverse research lab where we study youth suicide, and over the past year, I've been meeting with 3 other colleagues in a group that formed organically. This is Dr. Julia Diaz-Gomez, Dr. Lilian Polanco-Roman, and Joe Mañana, future doctor. So it's a group that consists of former members of my lab who are now at different stages of their careers. They call each other academic hermanas, meaning academic sisters, which makes me their academic mom. And we call our group a healing circle. We differ in age, marital status, sexual identities, age of our children for those who have them, and stage in our professional trajectories. We meet every 2 to 3 weeks or so virtually, and every 3 to 4 months or so we also try to get together in person. I think there's a photo of us. I don't have one of us all together. We've had some difficult conversations, ranging from topics such as racial trauma in the U.S. and in academia, what it means to be a disruptor in environments that pull for assimilation, the impact we want to have with our careers, and our sometimes diverging views on world events. We don't always agree. I can imagine that some side conversations have happened about things that I've said, the Gen X versus millennial thing. But we show each other grace, and we show up for each other. Recently, we wrote a chapter together on healing from racial trauma in academia, where we described our experiences as Latinas in the academy to help others feel less alone in their journeys and to chart a different path forward. When we are plotting to transform academia, we talk about other things, such as our families and friends, our retreat into faith fantasy novels, celebration of the return of Bridgerton, and through it all, the need for radical hope. Finally, we share micro moments of joy. Things like receiving grateful messages from students, appreciation for our work, meaningful interaction with our children, and in the spirit of finding joy in the small moments, here's an example of some of my hyper moments. Now, you may look at that, you don't see, these are text messages from my daughter. They don't say, Mom, you're the best thing since sliced bread, I couldn't live without you, I love you. But, in 16-year-old daughter speak, that says, I miss you, when will you be home? So I was out with my friend Anna, and it's 7:51 p.m., and she's asking me, like, hey, is there a sugar daddy who's going to make us rich, otherwise why aren't you home? And in the second one, she's taking an intro to psychology class, and she needed an answer to a question. And as you can see, this is urgent queen, and she wants to know. Incidentally, Regina means queen in Italian, but I don't think that's why she calls me queen, because she also calls my husband queen at times. Earlier I told you that this was not going to be a story about how I overcame my anxiety. And it's not. My anxiety is still there, sometimes teaching me things, sometimes getting in my way. I'm fortunate that God winks at me from time to time, reminding me and reminding us that we're not alone and that we're loved more than we think we are. This sermon is a wink right back. Additional information. I'd like to highlight the Hope Center of Harlem, which focuses on faith-based communities and mental health and provides, I think it's free treatment. I also wanted to introduce a song. If we could go to the next slide. This is a song that was written by a friend from college close to 30 years ago. Her name was Jen Shu, but it's now Jen Larrett Smith. And she put out a CD in college, now she's a social worker. I don't know if she even thought of this song in years, but it's always come to my mind. And I asked her if we could sing it today, and so she sang it, sent me an MP4 file, and Angela was kind enough. I know I learned that you plan weeks in advance, which I should have known better. But thank you so much for learning it and for singing it.